In this lecture, I'm going to be covering the Age of Enlightenment, which is our next topic for this course. You can see that that covers the time period of 1685 to about 1815. And the Age of Enlightenment is a period of time when when intellectual people are striving to understand human behavior and looking to how to improve society using the power of reason and logic. The political philosophers of the Enlightenment believed in what's called the natural law, which is a universal law that, unlike physical laws, can be applied by just using reason. So there are two views on government that came about during the Enlightenment period. And the first person's view on government is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan. And in Leviathan, he states that people are naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish, and that people enter a social contract. And people who enter this social contract need to give up some of their rights in order to live in an organized society. If they don't enter into this social contract, then society will be just filled with corrupt people and people only working towards their best interests, and that only an absolute monarchy can ensure an orderly society. If people choose their own government, it won't be orderly, and the only way to ensure that people are living kind of this in a checked society is through an absolute monarchy. So he gets a crown. So he believes in an absolute monarchy. And then that contrasts with the view on government by John Locke. John Locke believed that people were basically good and moral, and that people have certain natural rights. And these natural rights are life, liberty, and land. And people create their own governments in order to protect these rights, or they should create their own governments in order to protect these rights. And it should sound familiar because our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution is based on the ideas of John Locke. John Locke also writes that if the government fails to protect these natural rights, so the people are entitled to overthrow their governments. His ideas are used again in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Oops. Okay, so this is also called the Age of Reason, and there's a lot of different philosophers that come about during this time that spread ideas that have really long-lasting legacies. So a philosopher is a philosopher who believed that people can use reason and logic to fix social problems. So the first one we're going to talk about is Voltaire. He's a French philosopher. He's a writer who fights for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the ending of the slave trade, the ending to corrupt people in power. And his significance is that the freedom of speech, his ideas of freedom of speech are used in both the US and France's declarations. And then later on, it gets embedded into the US Constitution as one of those Bill of Rights amendments. Next, we have Baron de Montesquieu. And Baron de Montesquieu, he's also French. He wrote a book called The Spirit of Laws. And in The Spirit of Laws, he talks about the separation of powers and how the separation of powers within a government will protect people's freedoms. If you have a government that only has one branch, that branch will become too powerful. So, by splitting into three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, it keeps all three of those branches in check and it helps one branch from not becoming too powerful. The significance, as we know, is that those three branches or that three branch system is used in democracies all over the world today. You can remember Baron de Montesquieu, he has three names, and there are three branches of government. Okay, the next is another French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he writes a book called The Social Contract. And in the social contract, he writes that free people create society and government, and that government should be small and it should be freely elected. Okay, free elections meaning people can choose whatever whoever they think is best going to represent them in the government. They can run for government if they so choose. And so, really, this is kind of the bedrock of democracies and the election systems that are used across the world. Next, we have an Italian philosopher named Cesare Beccaria. And Cesare Beccaria really advocated for the ending of torture and interrogations, ending torture for interrogations and punishments. In the Middle Ages and moving into even the Renaissance era, and even a little further, torture was used in a lot of, especially through like the monarchies. When people challenged the monarchies, people were tortured to get information or tortured just because they had some sort of crime. And Beccaria advocated against the use of torture. The significance of this is that, again, it's embedded into the U.S. Constitution. It's one of the Bill of Rights amendments that that no cruel and unusual punishments are allowed. Next, we have a woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, she writes that women should be able to decide what is in their best interest, that they shouldn't have to be dependent on husbands, they shouldn't have to be married at young ages, that they should be able to be in charge of their own lives. She advocated for equal education for boys and girls, and her ideas were used in so many different women's rights movements across the world. Her ideas are used in the women's suffrage movement when women get the right to vote in the United States. Then later on, her ideas become the bedrock of the second women's rights movements in the late 60s and early 70s in the United States. And so, even though her ideas came about centuries before these movements took place, they continue to be built upon and they continue to be important as people continue to challenge what the role of women is in societies across the world. So, for the legacy of the Enlightenment period, number one, it's the inspiration for the American and French Revolutionary Wars. It produces three long term effects: the belief in progress, that the societies can continue to improve if people are willing to find ways to improve them. The second long term effect is that the world starts to move towards a more secular outlook for the most part and have a more non religious outlook. Think of the separation of church and state, which many governments practice, like that in the United States, we don't have one national religion. Um, Anyone can practice whatever religion they choose. That would be a product of these Enlightenment ideas. And lastly, the importance of the individual, that individuals are important and that individuals should be free to pursue what pleases them. So the Enlightenment spreads through a variety of means. It spreads through salons, which are like when people would get together and they would drink and they would share ideas. Salons would be, it's kind of what's pictured here, places where they would go to meet and exchange ideas. It also spread through what was called Diderot's Encyclopedia. This is one of the first encyclopedias that was created, and it was a book full of articles and essays from Enlightenment thinkers. You could find information on a wide variety of topics in this one book, and that helps people to understand these ideas beyond just the philosophers that are talking about these ideas. This becomes available to the general public, and then your general public starts to understand these ideas and want the same things that the philosophers are advocating for. You also have new artistic styles. Before the Enlightenment, you had a artistic style known as Baroque, kind of what's pictured here. It was very ornate and extravagant architecture. You can see here like all the gold that is lining the ceilings and all the carvings and the glass chandeliers. And then after Enlightenment, you have neoclassicism, which is more simple and elegant. It's inspired by Greek and Roman art. You also have a changing in the styles of music. Classical music becomes popular during the Enlightenment period. It's lighter, it's more elegant, it's played in all sorts of different venues across Europe, especially. And then, for the first time, fictional novels began to be widespread, so people can read for enjoyment, not just to gain knowledge necessarily.